And do we also have them in our packet? We do. Is there a motion?
I will move to approve the minutes of the June 22nd meeting.
Second.
Okay, any discussion?
See those tenses, they're corrected.
Yes. All of those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So those are adopted. And now we're going to have a conversation with Tom Cavett about the economic forecast. Thank you very much for joining us, Tom, for spending the day in the State House with us. So we are not putting stuff up on the screens. We have paper documents here, and I assume this has all been posted to the JFO Joint Fiscal Committee website. For folks who are watching us, they can find these documents again at the state legislature's website. You go to the big website, and then you find the Joint Fiscal Office, and then under the Joint Fiscal Office, we're going to go to the Joint Fiscal Committee, and then after that, these documents under the state. I hope.
Yeah, there's a direct.
Good luck.
Or there's a direct link. Anyway, so folks can find it. We'll turn it over to you, Tom.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much, and good to be back in person. This is an accomplishment for the state, and it's hard to imagine. It was not that long ago. It was really, about a year ago plus that, things changed radically, and we were looking at, this severe collapse in economic activity and a once in a century pandemic. And now, remarkably, we have one of the most favorable fiscal situations that we've ever had. So this latest forecast update is the largest recommended revision ever. And it's not just a blip. We think there's sustainability at least through the next 2 fiscal years. So it's a different landscape, and that's what this whole thing I think has taught us is adaptability and be willing to change, be willing to adjust, recognize new things, try to understand them, and then understand these things. So all these economic relationships that we developed with models and things like that, many of them were useless, and we developed new metrics. We worked with the utilities in the state to come up with demand things that were showing us every day how much electricity was used by what sector, so that we could try to see well, how are people's behaviors changing? There's a chart in here that shows the residential, commercial, industrial use, and it was just fascinating to see how people, they're working at home, well, the residential electricity goes way up, and they're not going to the office or not shopping. But that's been an important metric to try to see how people are coming back, because that's a big part of the forecast. When we last did this forecast, it was in January, presented in January, but done with a December control forecast. So the assumptions that were made were the things we knew about in December. And there were 2 critical assumptions that were made that shifted. And one of them was the speed with which a vaccine would be deployed and what the uptake would be and what that would mean for reopening. And the best estimate we had at the time was October. So we felt that we would be pretty much where we are now in October. And so that's really to the credit of a lot of people, both at the state and the federal government. But that's made a phenomenal difference in near-term revenues, and that's a significant change in the assumption. The other assumption was that there would be divided government in Washington, that the executive and congressional branches would not be controlled by the same party. And that seemed like a reasonable assumption in December, but it turned out not to be the case. And so that has meant a great deal more fiscal support for the economy, great deal more spending. And that has enormous implications. When we say more spending too, it's sort of like, you use a word like more, but I don't know how to like express the magnitude of what we're talking about, because we hardly ever talked about trillions before, trillions were, and I still find myself looking at numbers on the sheet and calling a billion, a trillion, a billion, or a billion, a million, something like that, because this is at a scale that's hard to appreciate. But, if you took all the spending on World War II in current dollars, it'd be about $4 trillion in the United States in present dollars. And, the spend just on the COVID stuff is probably north of 10 trillion. And I've got a couple of tables that show all the breakouts and things like that. Some of it most of that is deficit spending. And then there's an infrastructure bill queued up, both the bipartisan one and the reconciliation plan, that totals about 4.1 trillion. Now, more of that is paid for. Most of that is paid for, although some of the payment mechanisms are questionable, but still it's not pure deficit spending, but it will have stimulative impacts as well. The other thing is just the timing of these, of this avalanche of money that's out there. A lot of it is approved, and that's where it's announced, and you hear, okay, the state got da 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 da. That doesn't mean it's entered the economy. That doesn't mean it's spent and things on the ground are happening as a result of it. It means we have the right to spend it at some point in time. Some of the early money had very, very quick deadlines and limitations and things like that. And it was difficult, in fact, to get it all deployed in places we thought would be useful. But much of even that early spend was not actually hitting the ground. So, when you think of the checks that were just sent out to everybody, a great deal of that was saved. Moody's Analytics estimates that $2.6 trillion were saved of the pandemic money that's been dispersed. That's sitting there, available to be spent at some future time. Obviously, the people that are more apt to save are higher income people, so there's not the same pressure to spend it, the same need, but that's capacity that affects not just the first year, but out years. And so that's another thing we've been trying to get at is okay, where is the money going to land? When is it going to get there? And then we look at multiplier effects, because a lot of the tax revenue that we get isn't from the first tranche. The money that went out as individual payments was tax-free. The PPP money was tax-free. So if you thought, oh yeah, all that's going to be taxed, we could calculate that, and yeah, that's our tax, but it's not. It's going to be, people get that, then they spend it, then somebody else receives that spending as income, and some of that's taxable. Or they, spend it on some activity that in some way gives rise to a tax liability. And that is the really complicated part of it, because the velocity of the money that's being spent is unknown. And typically we will sneak up on what that would be. That's why we didn't say, oh yeah, the state's going to be rolling in debt. We could see that more money was coming in, but I wanted to see it before I really believed it. And we've seen it now in this fiscal year, and it's substantial. It may be even more substantial than forecast next year. It's possible there would be less substantial, the risk of the forecast on both sides, but there certainly is a possibility. There's so much that's unknown about how it will percolate into the economy that it could actually be higher. But it is a phenomenal event, and it is something of an experiment, because I don't think there was not some cohesive plan that was either formulated prior to the pandemic, the way there are healthcare plans about how to deal with the pandemic. There was no economic plan that said, if everybody's staying home, which is the healthcare recommendation, how do they buy food? How do they pay for rent? How do they pay rent? How do they, you know, nope. And so the reaction, the response was, oh, there's an economic problem. There's this downdraft. People are in trouble. Let's do all the things we did last time we spent a lot of money, which was for a financial recession. Let's do those same things and see if that works for a pandemic. So as a result, it was not really focused. It wasn't really targeted on the people that needed it. There's a lot of money that was just shoveled out the door. And so in terms of the efficiency of it, you know, you have to scratch your head. But yeah, is it possible to turn the economy around by just, you know, spending enormous amounts of money? Answer is yes, there really is. And this is basically what in economics is called Keynesian economics. It arose after the Great Depression, as you know, the notion that government could step in and deficit spend and right a sinking ship. We have the capacity to deficit spend like no other country on the planet. And it's in part because our currency is used as a global currency. So we don't have, and partly because it's the largest economy in the world too. So we have the capacity to tax people if we need to make payments. So there are lots of things in our favor, and the most powerful military. So all these things give our country the option of being able to do this. It has never been exercised in this way. So, you know, the way it trickles down to state government and state tax revenues and all the rest is there's still a great deal of uncertainty about that. So that's one thing that's going on. The epidemiological part of it, I talked about, yeah, early reopening. We're here without masks and feel relatively safe. But there's still a lot of risks. I mean, there CDC reports out yesterday on, you know, new concerns about the Delta variant, and there will be other variants because most of the world's not vaccinated, and this is what happens with viruses. So you have billions of people that potentially are, you know, will be supporting creation of variants, and the speed with which it floats between countries is amazing. Even when they're sort of locked down, it's just phenomenal how quickly, you know, something that they first identified in Great Britain ends up in Vermont, or something in India, you know, shows up in Florida or Missouri or wherever. We're connected in ways that make that happen pretty quickly. So anyway, lots of challenges on the epidemiological front. We'll be watching that carefully. Those are big risks to the forecast. But the long and short of it is that there's a lot more money than had originally been expected. And, you know, that makes life easier in terms of budgeting, but also presents challenges about how to most effectively and impactfully deploy those resources at the state level. And yeah, so anyway, the report goes into detail a lot of areas. I think some of the most useful aspect of being here is just to do Q&A and hear what things you're interested in or have questions about it. I'll respond to those. I could walk through more, but why don't we just open it up for questions and see what you're thinking.
Thank you.
Keith.
Thank you. So I had mentioned to you back in the governor's office about inflation, just to do a deeper dive into the concepts. Certainly, we're hearing that the Fed is saying that they're thinking it's more transitory. I'm in the camp of there's some that will be transitory. I think commodity prices are coming down, but they're not going to decrease wages. So wage inflation is not going to be transitory. Wage inflation will continue. The question is, and answer this, well, we will all make a lot of money, which is where does it stop?
Yeah.
You know,
So it
causes it to stop.
Yeah, so it is an open question right now, and the Fed keeps saying it's transitory. That's kind of their mantra right now. And there's certainly sound theoretical basis for thinking that there are supply bottlenecks that exist, both, you know, because of things that are happening in foreign countries and traffic and trade and lockdowns and all the rest, that many things that can create these bottlenecks and shortfalls. And those often tend to resolve themselves fairly quickly and are not permanent features of the economy, and therefore it does pass. I think the headline inflation numbers are always presented year over year. So the last, 5.4% CPI is relative to the prior year. And it's important to remember that the prior year period was right during the pandemic and the last few things. So prices actually were really flat and even declining in lots of areas then. So when you do year over year percent change, you're getting a bigger jump because the thing you're comparing it to was depressed. So, you don't want to overstate that. But on page 16 of the report, there's I just pulled out, a decomposition of some of the items in the CPI, and there are zillions of them. So I mean, it goes, they're phenomenal.
Very busy.
But it's dizzying. Yeah, very busy. But what I did was I indexed it to June of 2019, which was, 2 years back. So whatever that percent changes, if you divide it by 2, you're roughly getting what the annualized would have been over a 2-year period. But the main thing to see is how, each one of those lines has a story. If you, look at something like gasoline. So it's going along, it's kind of rising. Early on, price went way down because people weren't driving and demand dropped and everything. Stayed, below for a while, and then has popped up recently and had pretty high price increases, right? So that's that story. You look at used cars and trucks, which explain a really big part of the whole of the latest CPI increase, because that has fairly high weight, and that's like up 40% relative to June 2019, but it was below the zero line for quite a while, because again, people weren't driving who needed a car. But then all of a sudden, people don't want to take public transit. Everybody wants their own car. They're going to be driving. So people that didn't need cars need 2 cars if they're both people are needing to go in and out and things like that. And public transit in urban areas wasn't, and you also then get demand for new cars, and that being constrained by the computer chips that are essential to everything we use these days. And by the way, GlobalFoundries makes a lot of those chips that go into both cell phones and vehicles. That's a big part of their end market. So, but they're, they and every other semiconductor manufacturer is running as hot as they can, but the demand is outstripping. But some of those things you'll see will get resolved. You look at meat prices shooting up. Remember the meat packing, when there was COVID, was in the meat packing plants and they closed down. So meat prices spiked and they dropped down, then they come back up. So all those things are happening within, the overall inflation number. I think it'll take some time before that settles out and we get a clear read on that. The PCE price deflator, which is the price measure the Fed uses, it's a little different than the CPI in that the mix of things in it can change. You can have substitution. So the price of apples go up and they think oranges are a good fruit substitute, and the price is low, that it'll substitute and it'll adjust for that. So generally tends to be a little bit lower than the CPI, but even it was, the last reading was relatively high, more 3 to 4% range than 5. But it's an open question. The wage part of it seems like we're getting wage pressures that could stick, but again, the service sector is competing with wages that are domestic, but a lot of production wages are competing with global wage prices, which are not going up. So, that too, will be a whole story unto itself. But I think it's too early to say, if I had to bet on it though, I'd say that inflation is going to be higher than our assumptions that we have in there, at least in the near term. That can trickle into some other policy areas. The state and local government deflator, which is used to set the education per student payout, is probably going to tick up as a result of higher inflation, even though that's the mix of things that go into that are not, kind of worst case items. But, that's why we need to pay attention to it in a lot of ways. The other thing is if inflation really did get out of control, you'd see the Fed having to balance that by slowing the economy. They would do that by raising interest rates probably. So, that's kind of a forecast risk and something to keep in mind.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Cadet?
Tim, did you have something?
I did.
Yeah.
Federal monetary policy and fiscal policy almost always overshoots. So we're kind of caught in a sine wave of economic kind of offshoots of either interest rates that raise too much and we have to deal with that for 5 years, or fiscal policy overshoots and we have to deal with the results of that. I'm anticipating that's going to happen again. As you said, this is unprecedented. How should the state prepare for that? Right now we're in a place where we could have foreseen even a year ago the amount of revenue overshoot. So that's one thing. But the other side of that sine curve is something much darker. Whether we're looking at what healthcare expenditures might be a year from now, our education fund. Peter mentioned inflation issues, but what should the fiscal agents of our state government be prepared for kind of the other side of the sine curve?
Yeah. I know it's not satisfying, but it is very hard to know, just for the same reasons that you mentioned, that it's unprecedented. So we don't have an example of this level of spending, and then we don't know what the plan is for the other side of it. I mean, a lot of people now feel like the Fed shouldn't be involved in quantitative easing right now. That should, you should back off that. But every time they even mention it, Wall Street goes crazy and they sort of like freeze in place. So that's still going and going and going. In terms of fiscal policy, that hasn't tended to overshoot the way this is. Like if you looked at the Great Recession, probably would have been better to have a stronger fiscal policy mix and less monetary stimulus. Would have been a better way to deal with it. Again, for a pandemic, it's a whole different set of problems. And I hope, using what we know now, there is planning in the future that says, here is the most efficient way to do this. But it's unclear what the other side of this is going to look like. I do think the risk that the fiscal stimulus has been too much will start to show up in lots of ways. There'll be asset price bubbles. And I think arguably you could look at the stock market and say, relative to fundamentals, there's certainly a risk of that being overvalued. But right now, there's not a lot of other places for that money to flow. But I do think real estate's one of the areas where that will flow. There's been underinvestment in real estate in some regions. Real estate's not a national market because you cannot physically move that good, a building, from areas of excess supply to excess demand. So it's sort of fixed. So we have regional, areas where you'll get bubbles in one area and not in another area. And so there are parts of the country now where there've been double-digit price increases, like Idaho, for a long period of time, for several years. And there's still double-digit home price increases. That's not sustainable. Nobody's income's going up like that. But as long as people, see from, say, California, see homes in Idaho as being cheap and want to be there, it's affordable, it ends up still driving it further. So, but long-term, those things can't last. I think probably the best thing to do from a fiscal management point of view is to make sure you've got a really robust sort of, stored fund, saved fund, call it a rainy day fund or whatever, but that will truly get you through a cycle, not just a rainy day, but a rainy week or month or even a rainy year, such that you have some defensive capacity. You're not just spending that. That also can help the credit rating, which lowers costs. The other thing is to deploy it in ways that are investments, so that you're really looking at the return on that expenditure carefully to be putting it in the areas that can give you the best payback for new areas of expenditure. So, we've talked about things like broadband for years, and now there's money to do what we need to do with broadband. You combine that with an enhanced acceptance of remote work, and Vermont all of a sudden is competing for jobs, with New York City and Boston, and can come out very favorably in that competition if there's the capacity to connect digitally and electronically. So I think those two things would be, kind of cornerstones. Be really conservative about, how quickly, also not committing to things that are be long streams of, baked in spending, but to identify areas that you can, add something to make a difference and get a return. And that just broad brush.
The two things you brought up that I think are really interesting. One is, and I misspoke about the kind of the fiscal overshoot federally, which is
Yeah.
we've actually fiscally undershot. We probably underinvested in infrastructure for 40 years. And
Yeah, I think that's
now in
probably-
a very short and finite amount of time. We need to catch up. But then the other part with regard to Vermont and employment, and again, to Peter's point about inflation, is things like broadband allow people to work remotely, and will leave Vermont employers and the Vermont economy benefiting from people who might ordinarily work in a more urban, higher cost area working here, but their expectations in terms of costs are very different, probably than what traditional, costs are.
Yeah.
That drives, an economic shift.
Yeah, there are going to be pros and cons that come with that, right? So, and depending on where you sit, if you own a house, the value of that will go up as those, as that money hits. But then the assessed value of it will go up, and the taxes will go up. And if your income's not going up, that can be painful also. Now, if you sell it, you get more for it than you thought you would. But it's going to filter through in lots of different ways to the economy. There will be challenges. I also think, sort of watching, this came up in the e-board too, monitoring this in a more timely way, at least for some period of time, probably makes sense. So things that we used to do once a year or twice a year, we should probably do quarterly, or some things even monthly. But to keep a finger on the pulse of what's happening, so that if things are changing rapidly in some area, we identify that and can start to analyze it and explore options.
Senator Kitchen.
Thank you, Tom. One of the things you said, I wanted just to go back to it. Those of us who are working on budgets, we really struggle to make sure that we are trying to use one-time money for those one-time investments. And I think this year's budget's an example of that. And how you take and somehow identify how much of that revenue stream is base and that's going to be out there for ongoing in outer years for those ongoing spending obligations
Yeah.
versus how much we're going to have for a time limited period of time while this money is, as we talked about, sloshing around. And that's one of the, I think, challenges that we are going to be struggling with, because everybody's seeing these big numbers and everybody's got, of course, their list of what we should be doing or what they've always wanted to have done. But at some point, assume at some point, the state economy gets more normalized, we're going to be back to our base revenue and capacity. And we can't be building a budget that creates that ongoing spending obligation that at some point is going to be not sustainable, and how we can begin to parse out from this money how much of it really is for the best estimates. We should really use one time for one, we've got huge, whether it's broadband, whether it's housing, whether it's higher ed. I mean, the list certainly is right out there.
Yeah.
But it's how we differentiate with all this money, how much of it really is going to be there outer years. And so that we've got a budget that's realistic for that ongoing support.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be a challenge to do, and it's going to be a challenge for people to understand that there's a difference between this temporary influx and what we have normally for budgetary and spending capacity.
Yeah. Well, I think it's too early to say this is permanent money. So I think
If you said
Treat
that,
it.
I'd be very happy, but I'd be very surprised.
well, that's what
Then we
I
can make
think.
a lot of people happy, Tom, as opposed to the season of disappointment, as we call it.
Well, I mean, it's actually a good problem to have, because even if it's one time, it's
Oh,
still
absolutely, that's good.
useful. But I think, it would make sense to creep up on it. And at this point, I would not be treating it as ongoing. So I would think of it as, all right, certainly some of it might be. Some of the cursory projections that we made out 5 years suggest that in some areas this could really last. But I would not be quick to go out on a limb and use like that 5-year projection that's just cursory and say, yeah, we should, okay, 80% of it we can count on and just spend up to that. I think it would be, give it another year or two and see how it, some of these things start to churn around. I mean, what we saw in the revenue data was very broad based. So that's part of why we, kept things high. It was not like a few events that were, huge tax windfalls and reverberated through PI with, like we've had those before. And we typically take those out and, treat them sort of as one-time thing. It was quite broad-based, but that's still not to say that it's permanent. I mean, it's interesting that it was. I'll also be very interested to see how it breaks by income class. Again, from the granular data that we look at, it does look like there was a lot more income that landed in higher income groups, and they're paying higher marginal tax rates. So we get more from that. And that has been something of a feature of the pandemic, is that, the billionaires are getting more billions. And so there was something of that tilt already, but it's too early to know all of that. And that will help. On the corporate side, it was also spread out and not just, local Vermont companies, but large global companies and national companies that were getting, maybe a teeny apportionment share, but they're making lots of money and it adds up. So we think, the numbers in the next 2 years are defensible, but I will feel more comfortable when I see another year of them come in and understand what happened last year better.
Good. interesting challenge we have is the pre-pandemic revenues had been creeping up. And I know that at
Yeah.
least in my committee, we've been saying, when does one time become ongoing?
Well, that's
And now
true.
we have this confounding event in between with something else. But so we're going to
Yeah.
need to kind of parse out.
Yeah, no, the
Yeah.
confounding event too. I mean, we have 19,100 fewer people working now than, than pre-pandemic. And yet we have revenues that are through the roof. So, I mean, there are a lot of disconnects, but the main disconnect is what's happening with the federal money. So that's just a game changer all the way around. But that's been a challenge at different times over the last 30 years and will continue to be. But this is such an extraordinary circumstance. It's doubly hard, I think, to know.
Great. Thank you. I'm not seeing other questions and I think we are at time.
Great.
So thank you very much.
Thanks. If
for
there are
spending the day.
Any
and
further, I'm happy to respond to them.
I'm sure there will be.
Good.
Terrific. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Yeah, we got your number.
Yeah.
All right.
So next up, we're having an update from the administration. Commissioner Gresham is joining us. It's so nice to see, I feel like I should say this each time we see someone in person, how nice it is. Commissioner, if you'd like to ask Ms. Morgan to join you at the table, or I noticed she moved to the first row. I don't know if you want her next to you.
Candace?
Just in case I need.
Okay, well, she's with an RN.
I'd also note that Jason Aronowitz,
Yeah.
one of our analysts, is here.
Yeah.
Depending on how deep the questions get, it's always good to have
It's
some.
hard to know who was atop the mast there.
Horsepower.
It's Jason.
There we go.
Anyway,
Turn it over to you, Commissioner.
good afternoon, and indeed it is nice to be in person. So the committee has asked me to speak about the fiscal 21 closeout, of which I'm pleased to do. I thought I have sent along in advance the operating statements for the various funds. I thought what I might do is, instead of going through them line by line, I would just really give you some highlights and kind of tell you where we think we are. I would start off by saying that the closeout for all three of our major funds was really much smoother than we anticipated a year ago. I don't think that would surprise anyone. But not only from a financial standpoint, but also from an operational standpoint. We didn't have any calisthenics we needed to do. We didn't have any handstands. Money was where it should be and things worked. So, I mean, that was pleasing to know, in part because we were still substantially operating remotely. But also because there was a fair amount of revenue and appropriations coursing through the system. So closeout was actually quite smooth. Looking at the T fund first, and in no particular order, but starting with the T fund, the transportation fund first, we finished FY21 with a little over $28 million on the bottom line. There's, pretty much as with everything I say this afternoon, there's a story behind that. Everything this year was a little bit different. But the committee will recall when at the end of FY20, back in the spring of last year, we were quite worried about the state of the transportation fund. People weren't driving, people weren't buying things. And so we, as a precautionary level, and also really, frankly, to make the books work, we reverted about $24.5 million from the transportation fund, predominantly from projects that were in the pipeline, but were not shovel ready. And that's typical. There's always a lead time between when a project is envisioned and it actually happens. So in the meantime, that money was there. So we reverted that. So that is in a substantial way responsible for the fact that that is sitting on the bottom line as we closed out fiscal 21. The reason that was not used, I think, is understandable. Times changed. As anyone who's tried to purchase or lease a car knows the transportation market has revived. People are driving more, they're purchasing vehicles and registering their cars and the like. So the revenue situation there has improved.
Kirkland needs a new car.
Got a
On
new
the
one.
news that,
I had no trouble getting a new car.
because yours burned out by.
Well, you can always pay up for it, you know. They're there for the, you know, if you want to pay for it. Anyway, so, you know, it was a good deal. There were also some one-time, what I would call kind of quirky things. Most notably, because the appropriations in FY 20 were quite substantially lower than what they will be in, have been in 21. We actually took some money back from the stabilization reserve, which is kind of unusual. You know, it was too high. It had broken 5%. That we fully anticipate we will return next year. But, you know, so that you'll see in there. There was also about $5 million from the coronavirus relief fund that replaced T-Fund and enabled us to revert that to the bottom line. So, you know, net, we're finishing the year in a good position. I would note, as my friends in AOT never cease to remind me, we do have this thing that federal reauthorization kind of outstanding, which we anticipate will be probably operative in fiscal 23, which will require a substantial state match. We hope, because we're hoping that there's somewhere in the order of $60 to $80 million of federal money that will come to us through that reauthorization. And that's unrelated to any stimulus or infrastructure program will come. That's the standard federal highway money that comes. So that money that we now have on the bottom line, we are quite happy to say will be available for meeting our state obligation, our state match. So anyway, quite a difference in the T-Fund. Moving to the education fund, you know, there again, I mean, what a difference a year makes. You know, we finished out, you know, FY 20 in a substantially different mindset. And, you know, really there's not a lot of story there other than just revenues came in quite a bit substantially more than we thought. And they came in all year. So we were able to close what was a deficit at the end of 19 going into 20. And we were able to end the year not only having closed that deficit, but also with a positive balance that was a little over $28 million. That I would add includes the $14 million that was set aside as a potential need for teachers, pre-funding teachers' healthcare, teachers' OPEB. So that's inclusive of that. You know, that's in the $28.7 million of surplus. So really, it was quite a good year. I would note two things. One, I think the committee is aware from this morning's conversation that there was an additional $39 million upgrade to FY 22 for the education fund. That too will be available in FY 22. And I would also make a side note that there is also from the federal government some ESSER money that is with the districts, and some of which has been spent, some of which has not been spent. That goes outside the education fund. So I guess in a nutshell, what I would say is I think the education fund is in a very good position closing the year, and from a revenue standpoint, capacity standpoint, a good position for next year. And then finally, the general fund, you know, there too, similar story, a year made a big difference. We closed the year with a balance of a little over $200 million. That's 204.8 to be exact. The committee will recall that 100 million, the first 100 million of that will be set aside to enable the commissioner to substitute ARPA appropriations for general fund, using one-time general fund to substitute for ARPA. So of the 204, almost 5 million, 100 million will go towards that. and which leaves another approximately 104 million on the bottom line. So statutorily, half of that goes to the state employees OPEB fund. And then the other half goes to the balance reserve, otherwise known as the rainy day fund. And this is where there's a small quirk in that the rainy day fund, as the committee is probably aware, it has a statutory cap at 5% of last year's general fund appropriation, similar to the stabilization reserve. So what would normally be half of 104.8, which is 52.4, that went to VSERS, but instead of 52.4, we actually sent about $48.8 million to the balance reserve. So we now have the balance reserve and the stabilization reserve at substantially the same amount, a little over $80 million. And then what would have gone to the balance reserve, but due to the cap, will not go there, it just falls to the bottom line. So that will be available for your appropriation pleasure next year, starting out. I just wanted to make the comment, noting a former member who spent a lot of time thinking about reserves. When we ended this fiscal year in FY21, we had a total of $430 million actually in reserves for the general fund, which is just a stunning amount. 150 of that, I remind you, is for the pension reform that was set aside in a temporary reserve. But 280 million of that is in our traditional reserves. By traditional, I mean the stabilization reserve, the balance reserve or the rainy day fund, the 2753 reserve, and the caseload reserve. So that's, $280 million, which means that is over 17% of last year's base appropriation. And if you look at this year's base appropriations, FY22, 16.3%. Which again is just a stunning amount, considering that we were kind of scrambling to try to, I vaguely remember thinking we got to get to 13%. That's the target, and kind of rolling my eyes thinking, really? So anyway, and to put an even finer point on it, next year, one of those reserves, the 2753, will be empty. It's going to be a year where we have a 27th pay period and a 53rd week of Medicaid. So that reserve is $20 million. So, to kind of use as a firm number, $260 million of reserves, which is 16% of last year's appropriations, almost on the nose, which, again, is just a really, it's a nice level to be. I mean, it's extraordinary. So I guess in terms of next year, and the committee I know heard today, there's a substantial upgrade for FY22. I did want to put one small footnote in there, as a number of members may be aware. There is one potential use or advised use of the funds that we will have available. There is a receivable from Springfield Hospital that we are carrying on our balance sheet that in December of last year, as a result of the bankruptcy settlement, the 6.3 million of their provider tax receivable was considered, I don't know what the legal term is, null and void. We have not written that off. We still carry that, and I think it would be advisable to write that off. So I think that would be one use of the money on the bottom line. But, other than that, the governor's hope is that we can work with the legislature to figure out some, good projects to do, some one-time projects that we can put together for, for the benefit of Vermonters. And I'm sure we'll be talking to you before budget adjustment, but no later than budget adjustment about plans on that. So that's a kind of a quick run through of the FY21 closeout. There were a couple of other agenda items but before I move on, I just wanted to stop there and see if anyone has any questions on that.
I'm not seeing any. I think we can move along.
So there were two more reports that I provided. The one was on the coronavirus economic stimulus equity program. The committee will recall that that was a program that was stood up last year. It was funded with $5 million, $2 million of which was straight one-time general fund and $3 million of which came from the caseload reserve with the stipulation that to the extent that it wasn't used, the money that came from caseload reserve would be returned to the caseload reserve. There was a letter in your packet from me to the Joint Fiscal Committee that kind of gives you the lowdown on that. The numbers over the past couple of weeks have been slightly updated. The bottom line numbers there is just a hair over $2 million was put to work. The lion's share of that was to Migrant Justice Center. There was also smaller amounts to the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity and the Associations of Africans Living in Vermont. But of the $5 million, slightly over $2 million was granted and was used in total. And so just under $3 million, I think 2,936, I think exactly, will be reverted back to the caseload reserve. And for those who are looking for quite a bit more detailed explanation, I am sure that Susanna Davis or people from the Vermont Community Foundation would be happy to come talk to you about that.
Yeah, we may be interested in
Good.
understanding why there wasn't the take up that we thought there would be. It's budget time will ask.
We're happy to have that conversation.
Although when they asked for the time extension, they outlined some of the
The
difficulties.
challenges that we were hoping they'd be overcome. Yeah. Okay.
And then finally, there was a call for kind of an update on the coronavirus relief fund. And there too, I think it's a good story. I think it's 9.
Oh, no.
So there was a total of just a hair under 60 million that was either carried forward or appropriated in FY22. 15 million of that is going to the utility arrearages program. 2.5 million is for the legislature, and I believe 15 million is going into payroll for corrections to substitute for general fund. The remainder, which is just under 30 million, is with agencies and departments that is allocated and we fully anticipate will be spent. So yeah, we sit with a razor thin amount on the bottom line. Based on just recent history, I would expect that some more will come back to us. We're not of course, I've said this a number of times and been surprised. We're not anticipating a lot coming back to us. But we have a few months to go, and our agencies and departments are fully aware and getting the money out. So that's kind of all I got for you for my formal comments. I'm happy to take other questions if you have them.
Adam, maybe this is more informational. But and some members of the committee may know that the critical occupations final dollar tuition was rapidly subscribed. And in fact, the take up, particularly in 2 critical areas, nursing and mental health, were such that originally so this ties into a budget adjustment, which you were talking about earlier. And that is the money right now is sufficient to serve more people in the first semester, but it means that the money that was going to fund the second semester is having to be used to support more students, and that the administration has committed to making that request as part of the budget adjustment. So I just wanted to put that out there as something people may have heard about, and that is that take up, and the state colleges were hoping maybe to deal with it through the emergency board,
Right.
which was viewed not as the necessary structure to do it. So I just wanted to put you on record and let other members of the committee know that that there's one known item right out there, probably along with Medicaid, for the BAA confronting us when we return.
Understood. And I believe the committee, the emergency board members were copied on the letter that I sent to the chancellor. We made clear that we were delighted, frankly, at the uptake, and we hope it continues. And we are very happy to speak to them at budget adjustment and, make sure that they're not, that they are able to meet their obligations. But we simply thought that it didn't rise to the level of an emergency board issue, in part because they had the financial wherewithal to fund those scholarships through the fall. And, as the chair has said, we would have the chance to have a full discussion with them at budget adjustment. So we're happy to do that.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
We're looking forward to understanding the effect of a number of the initiatives that
Right.
we've taken. And it seems pretty apparent that the investments in workforce have been at least well subscribed to and have a real potential for creating a better future for Vermonters. So I personally hope we're able to make continued investments in that area to help folks. So thank you for your presentation very much.
You are welcome.
And with that, we'll move on to Global Commitment Medicaid. Ms. Clark, thank you for joining us. Again, it's delightful to see you. in
Delightful to
person.
see everybody. Good afternoon. It feels like it's been a month since I've seen you, not I think a year and a half, but I guess that's what Zoom does to reality. So thank you for having me here today. I did provide a presentation. It was just a little bit ago that talks a little bit, not just about global commitment and Medicaid closeout, but an overview of the closeout at the Agency of Human Services for state fiscal year 21. I don't know if there's someone that
This
can.
is cast out to us.
Okay, great. Perfect. So I think you can go right to the second slide. This table may look familiar to those who've been on the committee before, because prior to the pandemic, we were coming in, I think, pretty much every year to give you a high-level overview of how the agency closed, not only within the secretary's office, but then department by department. I should point out that some of this information on this slide is preliminary as it relates to the general fund carry forward. That is subject to Commissioner Gresham's approval. And so we'll be working with him and his team to finalize our plans for carry forward. So big picture, the column second from the left, the roughly $4.6 billion, that reflects the total expenditures across the Agency of Human Services in state fiscal year 21. It's important to understand that that is a duplicated amount. What I mean by that is for global commitment, for example, those dollars are doubly appropriated and doubly spent, both in the secretary's office and then in the departments that spend the global commitment dollars. This slide focuses on general fund and the amount that remained at the end of our closeout process. There was $66.4 million of general fund that was not spent in state fiscal year 21 that's available to be carried forward. That was roughly 5% of our FY21 budget adjustment. So an underspend by about 5%. We'll talk a little bit more about why, but primarily lots of federal dollars coming into the state, as you won't be surprised, as well as there was some underspend in some key areas, a lot of it also pandemic related. Of that $66.4 million, some of those funds were actually obligated by various acts the legislature passed requiring us to carry forward those amounts. And so that's roughly $17.4 million. And those include things like the Choices for Care program. As you know, in statute, we are required to carry forward some amounts depending on the amount that is available, as well as some kind of one-time appropriations that were appropriated in the FY22 big bill or various other bills last session. And so we are requesting to carry forward those amounts. Kind of in the middle of the page, I have another column of general fund obligations, about $4.1 million of general fund that we're going to request carry forward from finance and management. And this is to cover some liabilities from state fiscal year 21 that just due to timing at the end of the year, we weren't able to pay out. Therefore, we want to retain those general fund dollars to pay those bills in state fiscal year 22. The biggest chunk of our general fund balance, we are going to request to carry forward about $31.4 million from finance and management for a variety of reasons. Some of them very typical. We try to focus on carrying forward funds for Pay Act. And so we do include some requests to carry forward general fund for FY22 Pay Act. In addition, there are some pressures that we know we're facing in state fiscal year 22, the Medicaid budget, for example. I know Stephanie will be presenting the year-end report for Medicaid that will touch on some of those topics. And so we're trying to position ourselves in a good position financially for state fiscal year 22 in our carry forward request. And in the last column, there is an amount that is available for reversion. The bulk of it is within the Department of Corrections, and this was anticipated because we did receive coronavirus relief funds with the idea that the general fund would be available for reversion in state fiscal year 22. So that's a real high level snapshot of our closeout process. The next slide just gives you a trend over time of our total unduplicated expenditures going back to state fiscal year 03 through the closeout of state fiscal year 21. I think the interesting thing to note that won't be surprising is you see a pretty big increase in total expenditures from 20 to 21, and that reflects the influx of federal dollars into the Agency of Human Services.
We're going to need to have a footnote for 10 years from now to remind us.
Yes.
That's what that date is.
That is a great suggestion. It is fun to look at those spending trends over time when you can see like when we implement things and the change in our spending habits. So the next slide gives you a few highlights and an issue that wasn't new, but one that we're hoping to address working in partnership with the legislature and the administration. As I indicated earlier, one of the reasons that we came in under budget essentially is because we leveraged coronavirus relief funds and other COVID-19 federal funding throughout state fiscal year 21. For example, Department of Corrections, coronavirus relief funds for their substantially dedicated staff in correctional facilities that really worked on the front lines of the pandemic. In the Vermont Department of Health, they had a variety of federal sources coming in, one of the biggest being the Epidemiology and Laboratory Capacity Grants, ELC grants. This is what's funding a lot of our overall pandemic response. And in the Department for Children and Families, as this committee is likely familiar, we're leveraging a lot of FEMA funds as it relates to our emergency housing program. To speak a little bit more in detail about FEMA funding, one of the exciting things from an accounting perspective that happened to us throughout the last year is that FEMA went from a 75% federal participation to 100% federal participation. We no longer needed a state match, though we were using coronavirus relief fund for match, which is an interesting construct. But in the end, we did not need state match for FEMA dollars. And so lots of behind the scenes accounting activity that my office had to be involved in. To give you an idea of the scope of FEMA funding at the Agency of Human Services, as of today, the state has roughly across kind of all sectors, $190 million of obligated FEMA projects. Of that $190 million, $142 million of it is at the Agency of Human Services. Not everyone may be aware that FEMA right now is one of our primary funders of our vaccine program. And the vaccine centers and sites that were stood up around the state have been funded by FEMA dollars. And so that's the bulk of that AHS share, as well as emergency housing. And so FEMA is a reimbursement program. So an interesting thing at our closeout is that we haven't anticipated receipts in the FEMA Interdepartmental Transfer Fund because the Department of Public Safety is it's the single state agency for FEMA. And so they coordinate and have that direct relationship with FEMA. And so they transfer the funds to departments that receive FEMA approvals. And so we have anticipated receipts related to FEMA at the end of state fiscal year 21 of $38.1 million in the Secretary's office and another $10 million in the Department for Children and Families. And so we do anticipate to continue to work those FEMA claims and receive that reimbursement from FEMA. But we incur the expenditure and then it's reimbursed from the federal government. As it relates to underspend, and Stephanie will also talk a little bit about the Choices for Care program in the Medicaid year-end report, but there was some underspend in Choices for Care, as well as within the Department for Children and Families Child Development Division. And so that led to some of the general fund that was available at the end of the year. The issue that I wanted to highlight to this committee is that the Vermont Offender Work Program Special Fund did close the year in a deficit of about $1.9 million. In the grand scheme of things at the Agency of Human Services, 1.9 is not an insurmountable amount of money, but it is a structural deficit that we have been dealing with for a few years at the Department of Corrections. And we want to take action in the next year and have actually requested some carry forward to help us kind of fill that deficit. And then the Department of Corrections does plan on doing some analysis to try to determine a path to sustainability for that program. And so it's really shifting trends. Well, the pandemic didn't help because some of the work crews and things like that were not able to operate, and as well as shifting trends in terms of what we purchase from the Vermont Offender Work Program, furniture, for example. So those are some highlights from our closeout. And then as required by the big bill and for state fiscal year 22, I'm going to report to the committee on the Global Commitment General Fund reversion per C-102 of Act 74. As you are aware, we were required to revert $42.5 million of general fund in our global commitment appropriation in the Secretary's office. That reversion took place on June 10th. It includes not only the impact, and that reversion was predicated on the 6.2% federal medical assistance percentage FMAP bump that the federal government gave to states to help with funding concerns in the Medicaid program related to the pandemic. And so the construct of the budget was we were anticipating the general fund freed up by our ability to leverage those federal dollars. So that reversion happened. It happened all in the Secretary's office, though there are some component pieces that happen in the departments. They also enjoy the 6.2% FMAP bump, and that is in the Department of Children and Families for the 4E program, as well as in DEVA. So, and then the other item, the FY22 budget is built with $66 million of general fund anticipated to revert from the Secretary's office global commitment appropriation, again, associated with the 6.2% FMAP bump. This assumes that we will be able to leverage the FMAP bump through March 2022. The way it works with the federal government is the extension of the FMAP bump is linked to the public health emergency that federal House and Health, HHS, is the one that issues the public health emergency. And so once they extend that emergency for 90 days, if it's at least one day in a quarter, we will be able to leverage that FMAP bump for the whole entire quarter. So it was just recently extended, so we know we'll be able to leverage it through December 31st of 2021. Not clear yet, and that we closely watch to be able to understand if that's an issue that we'll have to work together if it's not extended. I think unfortunately, given the way the pandemic is moving across the country, you know, that means that perhaps the FMAP bump will be in effect. That's it. Are there any questions? It's been a busy year.
Extraordinarily busy for you, yes, as well as a lot of other people. I'm not seeing questions, so thank you very much, Ms. Clark.
Thank
you. I do have one
What's-
question. What's the status of our 1115 waiver renewal, if you can share anything?
Sure. And for reference, I think we did give a presentation at the Health Reform Oversight Committee not too long ago. But we are still kind of in the midst of our negotiations. I will tell you that for our federal partners, the federal government's only recently appointed Dan Chaw, I think that's how you say his name, as the head of CMS. And so they're still really getting their resources and staffing in place still after the change in administration. But we have been in earnest negotiating with the federal government, hoping to reach a regular cadence of meetings with them, similar to our last waiver. And we're really kind of waiting for them to provide next steps.
Thank you. Any other questions? Not seeing. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. So next on our agenda is, did I skip somebody? Oh, look at that, I skipped Stephanie. Sarah, shame on me. Well, the end of the year Medicaid report. We've seen you already, so
I know.
I'm not going to say how wonderful it is to see you again, but it is.
Folks have a copy of the report or had it electronically. And there's a link in the live, in the report electronically to the docs for HROC on the global commitment waiver, if you wanted to look at the summary documents that were submitted a month or so ago.
And that includes the documents that Jen Harvey did, it's the
Yeah,
summary of
yeah.
the legislative
Yeah.
knowledge.
It brings you right to the HROC page for that meeting. So the year-end report's not an action item. We've been doing it probably for going on 10 years now. When we switched away from doing a Medicaid related update at the emergency board, adopting this stuff, because it's just not, this doesn't priority value in the middle of the year. We do it in January. And Sarah alluded to several of the pieces, but I thought I'd quickly just go through the takeaways and see if there's any questions. The main takeaway for the program overall, these are the Medicaid and Medicaid related programs. We spent $1.8 billion. That's about $74 million total, less than what we expected when we were building the budget, what we passed through the budget adjustment, building the budget last fall, the budget adjustment, and whatever small adjustments we made in the big bill this year. But that $74 million underspend in Medicaid does not translate to $74 million of state funds. In the end, within the Medicaid arena, the global commitment arena, looks like we have about $8 million of general fund carry forward that can be used in the next budget cycle. And the reason for that there's several. The choice for care is one of them. That's one of the areas that's underspent, but we can't free up the state funds there to help anywhere else because it has to stay in the choices for care program because we have the statutory requirements there for reserve, for how we reinvest the dollars there. Something like the Success Beyond 6 program comes in under budget, but that's not matched by the state, that's matched out in the schools. And then we have the different match rates across the different programs. The other takeaway within understanding the underspending in Medicaid and the global commitment programs, there's sort of a two-way dynamic going on. In the DEVA global commitment program, which is the largest appropriation of global commitment dollars, $800 million, that actually came in over budget. And the only way that that program came in balance was because the ability to transfer in underspending from other programs and other departments into the main DEVA spending line. And so we have not, determined exactly what the cause of the overspending is. I'll talk about caseload briefly, but spending is either caseload or utilization of the combination of both. And so that pressure is likely to flow forward into the budget adjustment and maybe likely into the FY23 budget build. And there may or may not be offsets depending on, the status of federal funds in the base budget we've already passed to cover whatever pressure that is. But if we look at the caseload experience through the fiscal year, the caseloads for the majority of what we call the MEGs, the Medicaid eligibility groups, how people come in, were stable, except for the three main adult groups, where even though we adopted higher caseload last January, they still came in significantly higher than expected. And what drives that caseload higher is obviously people's financial situations, employment situations, whether or not they qualify for Medicaid, but also the suspension of redeterminations of whether or not somebody's eligible. Because when the 6.2 bump came in to being it was actually March of 2020, and it was the bill before the CARES Act, that bump in FMAP came with a restriction on moving people off the program. And so we suspend the suspension of the redeterminations as part of that. And so that creates sort of an ongoing hiccup that we'll have to work with in terms of forecasting the caseload, trying to understand when redeterminations will resume and what that might lead to as we get back into our annual cycle of redeterminations.
So redeterminations have not been undertaken since March of 2020.
At least then, and maybe even retroactively, because it went, the
So-
6.2 actually went back all the way to
there's been
January
absolutely
2020.
No deletions, it's all just been accretions.
Accretions, but people can can take themselves off, and obviously if people die on the program, that gets
I
updated.
can't take themselves off.
But,
Yeah.
and that's also had a small effect on a modest effect on the revenue that comes in under program
15,
premiums.
16, 15, 16 months, it's a long time.
And, part of there's a handful of the programs that actually come with a monthly premium. And that has seen less revenue in, because part of the way premiums get sort of paid up is in that redetermination process. People, and whether or not that, we can't move people off if they don't pay their premium. We can't go through that process.
When redeterminations begin, I guess this is an unknowable question at the moment. When they begin, will we have a liability for not moving people off quickly enough? Do we have any history on how that's been managed, or?
Well, we've had, obviously after Obamacare started, we had a 2-year period of non-redeterminations and an agreement with CMS about how we would structure and go through that. And that was, I don't think there was any financial risk where we had folks that remained on the program. And I don't feel, I assume that once the declaration is gone and you have an actual plan and program in place, it's probably a relatively low risk.
Yeah, you just
Sarah.
have to work the plan.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And then as we look forward, there's a sheet in a detailed sheet on choices for care. And choices for care will have, after we have a 1% reserve requirement in that program. And we did care, the budget was built assuming a certain amount was going to carry forward and help the 22 budget. But in the end, I think we have about $6.3 million of reinvestable dollars coming forward from 21 to 22 to reinvest in choices for care. But then as we look forward, and most of that savings in choices of care was all in the nursing home side of the picture. The home and community based was just a smidge over, really literally just a smidge over budget essentially. But as we look forward into 22 budget adjustment, we've talked about DIVA. There is an opportunity that was in the ARPA bill on the home and community based services. It's a 10% bump for 1 year on that package of services. And that's turned out to be a bigger estimated amount of money than what I thought it was going to be back in the session, where, you're thinking it's the DS programs and the home and community-based long-term care programs, but it's a bigger universe of programs. And so that looks like it might generate somewhere in the neighborhood of $65 million, and it can be matched again because it's dedicated to home and community-based services. Could be up to $160 million of money that can be spent over a 3-year period, specifically in that area of Medicaid. And it has to, you're not supposed to supplant with it. You're not supposed to take away your investment. It's an additive, strengthening the home and community-based service package and providers out there.
Yeah, is that what that public hearing last week?
Yes,
was
yes.
To
Yep.
roll out what the plan was?
Yeah, so the agency is in the process of developing with their stakeholders how to approach that particular opportunity that's in the ARPA bill.
So we anticipated spending
So we-
some of that.
We did actually
you said.
budget into
Yes.
that a little bit for the increases that you did in the long-term care and the
Residential care
and the designated agencies. We did spend a little bit into that because
Mhm.
anticipating that would be an allowed use because it is strengthening of that system.
The system, yeah. It's another area where we had federal revenue coming in, but we're also going to, it's a long-term obligation that we make with 3% increase.
Yeah, so,
We're going to need to attend to.
yeah, at some point that
The
sort of-
bump money
yeah,
goes
it
away and
merges
we
into the
have to-
budget. If you think about it, sort of as traffic merging, some of those pressures merge in the out year and you have to balance. And that's part of the understanding what
what
when
we
this
spend.
sort of revenue picture that you've heard of from Tom, how that plays out. So, we did anticipate a little bit, but we grow into some revenue when we were building the budget, but now it becomes a trickier process of having the dollars on the table and how do you spend them over time.
And not spend them twice.
Now we try not to let you do
Or
that.
recognize that they aren't going to be there for
Yeah.
unlimited.
And then Commissioner Gresham mentioned the Springfield Hospital. We did find out that there's an accounts receivable there that needs to be written down because it's been replaced with a promissory note over a much longer period of time. So, any questions from the crowd?
Thank you very much. So, we're now moving on to the second page of our agenda and other AHS updates. And first up is status of the retreat. Deputy Commissioner Crump. Did I say it right?
Yes.
Crump. Congratulations on your new position.
Thank you so very much. It's lovely to be here in person.
Yes, it is.
So hopefully you received the report that we submitted, which gives you some details around the financials for the Brattleboro retreat. We were here last year around this time to let you know that we put together a sustainability action plan. And so my goal would be to let you know some of the key points of how much of that action plan has been implemented and how it's going. And so first, I would say in terms of the 12 level 1 beds, the project was completed. There were significant delays due to COVID through the fall, due to staff shortages and other issues. However, the certificate was granted and occupancy was granted in February. And so the major problem we have right now in terms of occupancy for those beds is staffing. So they're still working through that process as we speak.
So are the beds open?
The beds are not open.
So none have been brought online.
None have been brought online. Right now, we're working with them weekly, getting lots of updates on their plans for recruitment. They have a plan to have enough staff. Right now, their goal is September 1st. I will admit that right now, recruitment for nursing has been extraordinarily problematic across the nation and in the state, to the point where most healthcare and mental health are competing for those resources within the state. But right now, we are turning over every rock and working with them, and they're giving us regular updates on their HR recruitment plans and processes. And one benefit that's happened through their implementation plan is the board of directors and leadership at the retreat has done a great deal of work with their labor relations And so they now have a partnership with that union that they're developing recruitment plans together, which is a significantly stabilizing force for that effort. Another
Okay, that's-
aspect.
That's good to hear because this committee, in the past, the whole issue around the labor issues at the retreat were a topic of concern, and in terms of the board, and that we had some testimony and a follow-up. So that's encouraging update that progress seems to be made in that area.
Agreed.
Are you reasonably confident that they'll hit a September 1 open date on the?
I would say moderately. I wouldn't know, to be frank.
Yeah.
My guess is probably closer to October, end of October.
So then this is causing a backup throughout the system, I'm assuming, and we're counting on. And these are, shame on me, I'm not remembering adults or children beds. They're
Both.
Both, okay. Yeah.
Both. Yep, we've seen a reduction in youth waiting at this time. Adults, we certainly are still having a backup. And it's something that we're looking at, getting beds online, not just at the retreat, but there are other staff shortages across hospitals that are working as well.
So in other hospitals, beds are not available because of staffing.
Yes,
Well, that's hard.
it is. It's been tough. I think we'll talk a little bit about workforce challenges across the state.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, that next on the agenda.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great.
I did want to hit a key point that one of the integral pieces of their action plan for sustainability was putting forward an alternative payment model to stabilize. And so we spoke to the development of that. Last time we were here, it was successfully implemented in March of 2021. And so, you know, the long-term impact of that, certainly maybe still too soon to tell. However, in talking to the retreat, there's just undeniably the fact that there's a stabilizing force from having a predictable payment every month. And we're seeing some other benefits to that as well, because with that predictable payment, we're able to focus on what are the metrics and performance we want to see in order to earn that. And there's a table set to have those conversations and bring that data forward. And so it's really helping with some quality improvements across the system. And I would say the retreat's been very open to reviewing that information and adjusting their practices to impact everything from a shorter, you know, getting people in sooner and having less wait time for admission. So that's been a positive piece.
Any questions on the retreat? We had them on a kind of a monthly or weekly review process, who aren't anymore, I assume. But how closely are you continuing to monitor?
Very. In fact, while I'm here, the commissioner's actually with them now. And so we meet right now monthly, and we have sometimes ad hoc, depending on with the staffing shortage, we're speaking on a much more regular basis as we talk about different, you know, innovative ideas to get nurses into the state.
Thank you. Representative Kornheiser.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
When the beds are full or closer to full, will the payment reform be enough to cover the cost?
I think in terms of the payment model, it's pretty early on. So, you know, I'm looking at the financial expert over here, but
I think that the intent of the alternative payment model is that they will be sustainable with that mechanism, but it is really important that it's part of it. In addition, as part of the work plan that's been ongoing between the agency, they've made other strategic choices that really have set that up to be sustainable once we normalize.
Thank you. Anything else for us?
What was it, on the total number, the capital constructions, that would actually was funded through the state for the retreat. It was several millions of dollars, I think, to do the improvements that were necessary.
7 million was expended for this project.
So that might have some beneficial impact in terms of reimbursement relative to cost. They didn't underwrite that. So that's encouraging. The other thing, when we talk about number of beds, and that is, can you give us an estimate? In other words, we tend to think of, well, if there are X number of beds, then people, none of them, if they're 100%, they're all full. But in fact, I assume the retreat can be like, it's like the psychiatric hospital can say, no, we're not admitting, we do have an empty bed, but we're not admitting any more patients because of a determination that the admission of another patient would be detrimental to the patients already there. So in essence, we have to be carrying some vacant beds all the time, so that we really don't have, if there are 26 licensed beds, you don't have 26 patients there probably most of the time. Is there an estimate of what that occupancy is out of those beds? Is it 95%? Just off the top of my head.
Yeah,
I wouldn't know what that would look like.
they're certainly not designed to be at 100% occupancy all the time for the reasons that you discussed. And I think there's differences at different hospitals. Some are run at 90%, pretty well okay. If you have the state hospital where there's a higher acuity, you might have some different things to consider when you're looking at occupancy rates. And so it's definitely something that we're tracking now. But I would say for the beds that are available in the state of Vermont right now, we are at 100% capacity, given the shortages.
How do I interpret that that they're at the 90% and that to add any more would be detrimental, or they in fact are all filled?
Well, we did conduct a needs analysis of beds last year. And so I think that's something that we're weighing right now in terms of, is it all inpatient beds that we need? And so we're only talking about math for that issue versus having some more partial hospitalization options that would impact.
Yeah, I understand that, but I was just, when you say we're at 100% occupancy, does that mean in fact there's a patient in every bed, or it means that we have all the patients that in fact can be treated and meet the standards that we're required to meet?
I see what you're saying. So of all of the beds that are open, all of them are filled. There are still folks waiting to get into beds, and if there were more beds, they would need a place to go.
I suspect we could have a very long conversation on this. We may want to, or another we may want to continue monitoring what's happening with them. Any other questions? Thank you very much. And then we also wanted to have a general, just quick touch base on mental health and the related workforce issues. And Ms. Wilcox is here to help us understand that. I asked that this be on the agenda since I had heard that the AHS was paying particular attention because of the issues that everyone's experiencing with recruiting and retaining people into really critical positions in the state.
Yes, agreed. And hopefully, so Cheryl Wilcox, I'm the Interagency Planning Director at DMH. And I am co-chairing a task force around workforce specific to our designated and mental health agencies that provide our mental health and developmental disability services across the state. So hopefully you have a very high overview, just 2 pages. There's a lot more detail beneath all of this, should you want more. But really wanted to let folks know that this is something high on the radar, not just of Department of Mental Health, but all of our departments and programs within our agency. So we have Dale at the table, Department of Health, ADAP, and then corrections, our designated and specialized service agencies, and then folks from additional folks from DMH. I'm co-chairing the group with the Human Resources rep from Healthcare and Rehabilitation Services, which is our designated agency more south. And we are and it looks like it's in color, which is always lovely. So the circles, I will say, the smaller circles around our workforce recruitment and retention are the strategies that we are digging into with more specific action steps beneath each of those. So looking at things like tuition reimbursement and loan repayment, we're getting funds out the door. The legislature actually allocated the 1.5 million. That contract is close to final. So also looking at compensation, work-life balance, all of the pieces that we know are really integral for any position. You have some data that shows there are 780 vacancies right now. That is of February. We will have more updated data soon. Vermont Care Partners is actually pulling that together. And chances are it's going to be over 800 at this point. So we are definitely seeing an issue with having enough staff on both mental health and developmental disabilities side to serve the individuals that really need that in Vermont. And so it's why we launched this task force. So we actually can all talk through what are the strategies that have evidence behind them. What do we need to do to make an impact on our workforce? And we're getting some technical assistance nationally through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So they're also providing information about what other states are doing. There is a learning collaborative that Anne, who I'm co-chairing this with, and I are taking part in just to see what other states are doing. How are they impacting this? It is a high concern for us. And so we want to make sure that we're really thinking of the detail and then what we can do as a state to move things forward. Because it impacts all parts of our systems. When we talk about beds being closed and how we bring folks to Vermont, it's a huge challenge.
Any first takeaways that you're willing to share, or is it too soon to ask?
From the group, I think, it's been interesting. I think key takeaways are definitely when we talk about folks with these agencies and the education they need often to be able to either bill Medicaid or draw down other funds, folks getting degrees and then having high loan payments is something that's really challenging. So that's a piece. It's really, it's a positive thing that we have funds that are being allocated for that. It's something we've heard from staff. Some staff have reached out to me from our agencies to also say this is what would make a difference. And so pieces like that, which also help. And then having more internships and relationships with colleges or technical centers or others so that young folks know this is a field they can go into. And then also have, if there's internships or other things, they have the relationship and then they know folks at the agencies know them, they can draw from them. We've seen some encouraging pieces with some of our agencies with some of the SAMHSA grants that we've gotten for COVID emergency crisis services and them having funds and then having an intern and being able to pay the intern to help. So they're getting compensated. They would have been interning without any funding because often many of us do internships. It's free work for folks. So those pieces have been helpful. And then as far as more detail, we're still really digging more into the detail. And so for each of the smaller circles, which are components, we will have action steps beneath each of them. We've already started filling that out. And as I said, I'm happy we have some other working documents that if you want more detail, but I would imagine in a couple months, we will have even additional information of kind of where we're headed and then suggestions of what resources we're going to need to really impact our system.
Great.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Thank you. So regarding the 1.5 million for loan repayments, is the intent here to just ask all the agencies who has loans out there and they don't need to apply? We're just going to allocate funds to each and every one of them to help pay off their loans, or are we having people actually apply to these loans? When does that close? And the big question, when do you expect money to go out the door?
Yeah, so I actually was working on the update memo for you all that is due in September. But I can tell you from working on that the contract, it's been close partnership with our secretary's office, DMH, and then the health department. So the health department is putting out the contract. It's going to Vermont Care Partners, but there is an application process and performance measurements that were asked for by the legislature that are going in. We hope that contract's going to be executed by mid-August. I always hesitate to put a firm date because we know things shift, and certainly if we've learned nothing from the past year, that's a big lesson learned. So that's the target and our hope. And then folks from agencies will be able to say this, we want to do this education. And then there's a commitment back to agencies.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
At least the money's going out. It started at 5 million.
Yes.
And that's what happens when money, well, and the whole purpose was for this and to help grow our own, really.
Yeah.
So the other thing that we know is we put money into critical occupations, mental health was one. So I wondered if you'd had any recent conversations or with the state college system or University of Vermont had $1 million as well for upskilling.
One day.
Yeah, in terms of, can that be kind of a pipeline, do you think, or do you have any sense of who is, are they maybe even could be employees of DAs who are taking advantage of this? I don't know. I was just wondering if you've had any recent discussions with the academic institutions in terms of who's in those programs and can, and how they could, if they're not there, how they could be recruited or identified.
It's a great question. It's part of our action steps on the plan. So it is something we'll be getting more information about and looking into.
And then I'm going to ask one last question, and that is the extent to which the shortage is exacerbated by most DAs are totally dependent on state funding. And this year's budget, we were proud, the administration proposed nothing. And I think the year before there was nothing, which is in essence asking the agencies to absorb any salary increases and any operating costs with no money. Just a sense of how competitive, because their resources are really what most of them are getting are through the state budget and through the department. Is there a sense of how much out of kilter those salaries are relative to other areas of relevant healthcare? Because obviously that is a consideration in terms of recruiting and what you're able to offer for salaries and the extent to which those salaries that are constrained with the adequacy is really determined by the funding to the DAs and SSAs.
Yes. I'm happy to address that. I didn't know if our deputy commissioner wanted to. But I think the compensation is a big piece of what we're looking at. We know that we often, folks at designated specialized service agencies either go to a healthcare organization or a school that is paying more. And so that is a piece we're aware of and that we need to do more thinking and planning for. I think the good thing is that I think we're all pretty thankful we had payment reform start in January of 2019, because at least during the pandemic, we've been able to continue having payments coming out, but it is an issue, right?
Yeah.
Did the 3% increase was that the funding would go for salaries? I think continuously looking at the turnover and why is something we're really interested in. Also for childcare.
I know this, in the past, we've gotten some estimate of what it would cost to bring salaries up commensurate with state employees, and it was millions of dollars. So it's not an insignificant factor here. I was just wondering what it looked like.
15% lower than what state employees are making is my recollection, something on that order. Yeah, so it's a lot of money. Big problem.
Yes, agreed.
Any other questions? on this? Thank you very much.
Welcome.
We look forward to continuing to work at this. It is an important issue. Commissioner Brown, please join us. We thought we should take advantage of this committee meeting to understand where we are with the emergency housing and what challenges you are facing and thinking about going forward as we continue to kind of go back from where we have been.
Sure. For the record, Sean Brown, Commissioner for the Vermont Department for Children and Families. As many of you know, we were asked to put together new eligibility criteria to implement as we came out of the pandemic. Those criteria are more expansive than they existed before the pandemic, but were certainly more restrictive than when we had no eligibility criteria during the pandemic. So we implemented the new criteria for new applicants to the system on June 1st in alignment with the legislation and the budget. And then for those in housing before that date, at the end of May, they were subject to the new criteria on July 1st. Just to provide some perspective, when we were working with a work group in the legislature in April, that's when the program peaked in terms of participation. At its height, we had 2,011 households participating in the program in early April. There were 2,358 adults and 441 children.
I'm sorry, Commissioner, can you speak up a little?
Yes.
There's a lot of white noise with the air filtration.
Sure, I'll try to speak up.
The mic doesn't microphone.
Okay, okay, all right.
Thank you very much.
Sure. And just to give you a point of reference, at the end of May, when the eligibility criteria went in for new applicants, we were serving 1,744 households. So we were already starting to see the numbers come down in the program. And then at the end of June, when the new rules went into effect for all participants in the program, we were serving 1,458 households at the end of June. As of this morning, we are serving 973 households, 1,122 adults. So that's down half from its peak, and 322 children. A part of the new program for those who are not eligible for the new program on July 1st, those households would be eligible for an essential payment of $2,500. We have provided that payment to 590 households as of this morning. Some left without accepting their payment, and we're trying to track them down now to make sure that they have access to those funds. In addition to those who successfully find housing, and we are seeing that happen, there are rapid resolution funds of up to $8,000 available for households, and they are availing themselves of those funds as well. One of the major challenges that we face every day, and our staff manage, trying to manage and making sure we have a place for everyone to go, is hotel capacity. We had projected that we would lose 250 rooms by July 1st. We have lost substantially more than that at this point, and we continue to lose them. Each week, we see more and more motel capacity move over to serve tourism or other needs. And one area where I would just point out, the agency is even competing for itself in some ways. One of the strategies the agency is using to, in terms of the healthcare workforce, is bringing in traveling nurses. There's no housing available, so they're looking to use motels to house the traveling healthcare providers. There's no capacity, and so we work closely with the agency to try to strategize where we see openings to make sure that we can either we're using it or they're using it for those other areas as well. Some districts, it's very acute. Newport, Middlebury, and St. Johnsbury and Morrisville are particularly acute, followed by Burlington and Barry. So we're managing nightly the number of rooms we have available with shelter capacity, and just trying to ensure that everyone who's eligible has a place to stay. We projected we would be at 650 motel rooms by the end of October when adverse weather hit. We can't project the future, with the new variants coming and their impact and what will happen. But where we are now, I'm concerned we will not have that many rooms available at the end of October, particularly if tourism is still strong during the peak foliage season. So we're going to begin strategizing on what other alternatives we can have in place as we expand the program once again during the adverse weather conditions, as we have historically done. I'm worried we will not have the motel capacity to meet that need. And as we've done in the past, when we've ran out on particular holiday weekends with the ski season in certain areas, we may have to stand up emergency shelters, pop-up shelters throughout the state to meet the need. And we'll start triaging and working on that and finding providers to operate those if we need. And so, you know, some of the strategies we're looking at now to address that at the peak, we had 76 motels participating in the program. We're down to 67, and of the 67 that are, we're having reduced rooms, and many have put us on notice that there'll be a significant restriction in August as their bookings have really taken off, and motel capacity is really slim across the state right now. And where we're seeing some of that pressure as well is in the rate that we're paying. Before the pandemic, the average motel room rate for the GA program was in the mid-70s. It crept up a little bit slowly during the pandemic. We're now at $100 on average. And so that's a pressure for the program as well, not nearly as significant as just the lack of motel capacity right now. I will just briefly comment on that we are involved in a litigation in the U.S. federal court brought by Legal Aid, challenging the definition of that was promulgated in rule. You know, that they disagree and believes it should be more expansive. We believe it's in line with the intent of the legislation in the budget. Just for the committee's reminder, historically, to qualify under the disability category and you only received 28 days, you had to be receiving determined disabled by the Social Security Administration, either receiving SSI or SSDI. Under the new criteria that went in effect in the budget bill, we maintained those categories, but also expanded it so that you could prove your disability in other ways. In the rule, we expanded it so that a healthcare provider could verify that you're unable to work for the next 90 days due to a disability, and you would be eligible for the program and you would receive 84 days. Also, for those with a significant disability, they have the ability at the end of 84 days to get 30-day extensions if they're still unable to secure permanent housing. That is being challenged. I don't want to get into the details. We're continuing talking with Legal Aid in hopes that we can reach a settlement. We've not been able to bridge that gap to date, but we will continue to make those efforts and while the litigation moves forward in the briefing on the motions that are been ordered by the court. So.
You said earlier in your presentation that a few of the people were exiting.
Yes.
For about 3,000.
Well, that would help with some of the transition costs. And then we'll have the emergency rental assistance program available for households to avail themselves to help pay for their ongoing monthly rental expenses.
And are those folks exiting to permanent housing?
Yes, some of them are exiting to permanent. Others are leaving the program to stay with family or friends. Some are moving on to the shelters are opening back up and that capacity is expanding.
Can you put some scale on some?
I would need to, that will take a deeper data dive and we'll try to provide that.
I have one other question. So food services for folks who are still housed in the motels, is that being paid for by FEMA or is that?
So that ended on July 1st. Children are receiving meal deliveries through the Agency of Education in the school systems for the summer. We also are
Site or as part of the
being delivered to where they're to the motel they're staying. And then also for those that meet the eligibility for Meals on Wheels, older Vermonters or disabled Vermonters, we're coordinating and enrolling those so meals can be delivered as well. Also, we continue to provide the expanded 3 Squares Vermont benefit, the emergency full allotment, and also the pandemic EBT benefit. A new round just went out this week to households, about $18 million.
And did the revenue stream for that end, or did you end it programmatic?
Because of the volatility that we're experiencing in the program and the reduced numbers, we knew it would be difficult to maintain. We knew the FEMA money would be available for a couple additional months, but families are moved and households are moving regularly now. As with the pandemic, they were able to stay for months at a time in a hotel. We are regularly having to move families as motel capacity shifts and they've booked out business. Like for instance, in the White River area, when there was a Dartmouth graduation weekend, we lost access to a majority of our rooms and we had to move families to other areas, and it was very disruptive. But that's kind of the environment we're now facing in the program.
Senator Westman.
I get a report every morning of the numbers of across the state in each district.
I don't want to worry. I'm not worried for it, but for us, if there was some sort of update on numbers every couple of weeks.
Sure.
Or at least in some regular amount.
Sure, we can provide a weekly, like the end of a week update.
You've given us a very nice description of the extraordinary work that is going on in housing folks. Folks are exiting, and can you talk to us about, and you've mentioned the payments and some of the issues there, but can you talk to us about what is happening with those folks who are exiting and what your knowledge is of their needs? And I'm from Montpelier, so one of the concerns that we're hearing is, people exiting without a housing strategy, and they're living rough, and what the consequences of that is.
And we are, we have increased our services and that our providers provide to folks still in the motels, but also community outreach to stay in touch with households to ensure their needs are still being met after they exit the program, whether it's permanent housing, family or friends. And some are camping. We believe it's a small number. We're not seeing a large increase for what we saw before the pandemic versus what we're seeing now, but some households are camping. We're aware of that. And so we continue to stay engaged with those households so that they are making sure they're availing themselves of the available services in terms of whether it's economic benefits or housing case management. We are a part of our work in OEO is working with Josh Hannaford's department and the Vermont Housing Conservation Board on the large sums of money that have been appropriated to expand shelter capacity and bring on new units for low and middle income Vermonters. And I believe just 53 million of the first round was granted out to a variety of projects. And so we're just working to make sure we're funding the services in some of those projects that are going to serve folks that we work with. And then also help just in technical assistance as those community partners put those proposals together to make sure they're meeting the needs in the areas of the state where we're seeing the greatest need and the nature of who needs to be housed. If you're someone who's older or with a disability, you may need some more structured supported housing services. And we just want to make sure we're putting the right supports and housing in place to meet the needs in the areas of the state that we're seeing the need.
Do you have statistics on the number of people, or do you have numbers on the number of people who have exited the motel program but have not entered stable housing?
We would need to work with our partners who manage the homeless information system, HMIS, and because that's the proprietary, we put information into it, but we're not able to get certain data out. So we'll need to work with our partners and we'll see if we can get some data for the committee on that.
I certainly would be interested in understanding that. We know what we've done, but this is essentially trying to understand what the gap is. Need is there. So thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I just want to add, I know that you're all working as hard as you possibly can, and people are leaving hotels and there's no houses to them. Are any options for the motel?
Yeah, the rental market and housing market in Vermont is at a stage that I think no one would have predicted. I mean, it's really having an impact on people's ability to find a place to live at all levels. So
I'm afraid your work is going to get harder when the next group of folks is no longer deemed eligible. And I mean, we're all going to be struggling with how to serve those, make sure they're safe.
Yeah, and many of those that we're serving now are families and households with a disability. And so we're working to identify who will be eligible for ongoing housing under the new rules, because they'll be eligible for extensions beyond 84
Yeah.
days. And then really focusing our energy on those households that we know that will not have ongoing eligibility, to make sure that we can help them meet their needs.
Great. Any other questions for the commissioner? Thank you very much
Thank you.
for joining us today. Yeah, good segue. And just in terms of just looking at the rest of the agenda, the following the discussion of the homeowner assistance fund, we wanted the next item is a recommendation from the group that was looking at the transition for the chief fiscal officer. And I want to just suggest moving that down on the agenda rather than potentially asking everybody to leave and then come back if we choose to go into an executive session. So for planning purposes and for the folks who are next up, if we get it, we're still okay on time. No, we're late, but
Yeah, a little bit.
yeah. So Commissioner Hanford, thank you very much for joining us. And we're being joined on the screen by Ms. Collins from the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. And, but I think we'll turn to you first, Commissioner. So thank you for being here.
Great. Good afternoon. Good to see everyone in person and three-dimensional.
It is.
You know, hopefully you got a chance to look at the very short memo, and I think your agenda was well timed, your time for this section, because, you know, unfortunately, we don't have a ton to update you on from where we were. You know, what I will tell you is that since the last time we met, you know, the Vermont Housing Finance Agency has been gathering data on needs, understanding the situation with mortgages and utilities and property taxes out there, and assessing those costs. They've done a survey with towns to see what the volume of delinquent taxes are, and have been coordinating with the Public Services Commission to see about homeowner utility arrearages. But unfortunately, the Treasury has not released their plan requirements yet. You know, first it was June 30th, they extended it to July 31st, and now.
Have your application in.
Well,
before
that-
the exemption.
Right, we can't submit an application until we know what the rules are to run the plan by. And they've just recently this week put a notice on their website that they've again extended to a date to be determined. But it's not like nothing has happened during that time. You know, the Vermont Housing Finance Agency has continued to prepare. They put an RFP up to look at contractors to run a website and run this program. They've put information out on their website about what the eligibility is going to look like. And they've continued to run the CARES Act funded mortgage assistance program, which has just you know, reached its sort of final allocations. They've received enough applications to allocate all the funds and are working through those payments now. You know, all said and done, they'll have distributed you know, approximately $10 million to, you know, nearly 1,000 homeowners with an average payment of around $6,700. What we are definitely going to do is share with you the draft plan. The Joint Fiscal Committee, as well as put it out for public comment as soon as we can release that. Once we've seen the actual Treasury guidance to respond to. We know a lot of what we think is going to be in it, but it's important to submit a plan that we know they'll be able to approve by incorporating all their requirements and guidance before it's released. You know, and the other unknown is how long they'll be reviewing these plans before approval. So that is impacting when we can expect that when this funding will be available and people can start applying. We don't have a date certain by which that'll happen until we can submit this plan and have a reasonable expectation for approval by Treasury. So that was rather brief by me, but that's essentially what the memo says. And we have said Maura Collins joining us, and then George Demas, who's the legal counsel for VHFA, and Max Krieger, who's the department legal counsel, in case there's any detailed questions about any of the considerations.
Thank you. So I'm sorry, I was multitasking there. You just gave us a nice segue to Maura Collins.
Yes, yep,
Yes.
Maura's here. She can give
Yeah.
you a little bit more detail or answer questions.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Commissioner. So with that, Ms. Collins and your team, we have a couple of other folks joining us. So will you introduce your colleagues and update us?
Yes, well, I'm Maura Collins, the director of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and with me is George Demas, our general counsel, who is the project manager for us internally for this effort. With Commissioner Hanford, is Maxwell Krieger, the legal counsel for the department. And Commissioner Hanford did a great job. I'm really here just to answer questions. I guess the one thing I'll say has already been said, which is we are working very hard to make sure that this program will be up and running the moment we are able to do that, and that Treasury allows us to submit a plan to them and then approve the plan. We are working through all the administrative steps now in terms of working to select a vendor and make outreach and educational information available to staff, to Vermonters, and do everything we can so that we can make sure that assistance gets to people as quickly as we're allowed to provide it.
Senator Kitchell.
Maura, it's hard to keep this all straight. The rental assistance, which we approved earlier, the rules changed and there were actually limitations on household income. And I can't remember, did that income limitation also apply to mortgage assistance? And if so, well, first of all, I can't remember, is there an income limit? Like it was 80% of area median income, I believe, for rental assistance. Is that true for mortgage assistance?
This program has always had income limits to it. They are higher than the rental assistance program. We can go up to 100% of area median income. And in certain areas, we can go up to 150% of area median income. The income limits that we expect Treasury to approve are actually linked to in the one-page memo that you received today. If you want to see for your county what dollar figures that really means. So because there are income limits and the CRF funded mortgage assistance program we've been running, we had also set income limits, but they were defined slightly differently. So there will be income limits to this program, but thankfully Treasury, the income limits that this program will abide by are in statute, and therefore Treasury can't change those on us at this point. So we are feeling fairly confident that unlike with the ERAP program, the rules maybe won't change on us like I think was happening early on with the rental assistance program.
I was just wondering whether we would see households that would have qualified for benefit under the old rules no longer qualify, but it sounds like maybe because there were no income, right, with the rental.
With the previous rental program, the CRF, there was no income, but there was a cap on the rental payments.
Right, but in terms of the income eligibility.
I think this mortgage assistance program, this homeowner assistance fund, these upper limits, I think will capture a lot of the folks in need in Vermont.
Yeah.
And also the cap of total assistance per household is fairly large, $50,000 and up to $60,000 per household. So there's a good chance we'll be able to satisfy, someone's entire missed mortgage payments and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And that those limits, for instance, are some numbers that we've put out that for public comment, there's a perfect example that is not in statute. That's going to be a state decision about what those caps should be. as we all know, the higher the cap of how much we give to any one household may mean the fewer households served. So there will be a balancing act that we will need to find. And so that's exactly the kind of information that we've put out our thinking at this point, but that may continue to evolve as we get more guidance from Treasury. And so you all will absolutely get a copy of our homeowner assistance fund draft plan the day that it goes out. I'll make sure that this entire committee gets it. And we will be having additional public hearings on top of the ones we've already had to make sure that we find that just right middle spot of the right levels of assistance that we can provide for Vermonters.
Thank you. Any other questions either for Commissioner Hanford or Ms. Collins and their colleagues?
I have one other question on the rental assistance, which was 200 million. And we were like saying, how in God's creation are we going to be able to expend all this? Could you just give us an update? on
Sure, sure.
Where we are.
Sure. And-
Relative to that pot of money that we released. It actually covered more than just rental assistance, but I was just wondering how we're doing.
Sure. And I'll give you a little bit of walk down memory lane here. We first stood up a CRF funded rental arrearage program, which was our choice. We saw the need in Vermont. We chose to use that funding. There were very few states that did that. We've to date spent $28 million of CRF money satisfying arrearages that wasn't available for forward rent payments. The new ERAP, Emergency Rental Assistance Program, and then VRAP, Vermont Emergency Rental Assistance Program, that the Vermont State Housing Authority is administering. There's two pots. The first was 210 million, and there's another pot for 152 million that has yet to even be accessed. We have dispersed over 11 million of that. The report I saw earlier this week, it's actually trending pretty closely with the CRF expenditure rate. And what we're starting to see is the percent of funds going towards arrearages is decreasing, and the percent going towards forward rent is increasing. So that's exactly what should be happening, as well as utilities. Utilities are covered in that payment. It's fair to say there's been some hiccups with that program. It's pretty complicated. Most of that is from the federal legislation itself requiring certain levels of documentation and verification, which have been challenging, which we didn't require in our CRF program. But all things considering, we are a leader in the nation in this program. New York State just launched theirs last week. Not a dollar has gone out in their program, and we've already spent over 11 million. What I think we also need to recognize going forward with this program is what is success. Folks have to be eligible. They have to be 80% median or below and have these other impacts. As the economy rebounds and the economy is doing well and people are back at work, less people will be qualifying. And so less people will be eligible as time goes on. And so us not spending all that money is not a failure. It's successfully having less people that are in dire straits of needing rental assistance. And so that's just something we're going to have to wrestle with.
Well, the prospect is that we won't be able to utilize it, some for the limitations on how it can be used, and secondly, because of the changing environment.
Exactly. And I think two additional comments, both this homeowner assistance fund and the second phase of rental assistance both allow for repairs, which is a new aspect that we haven't been able to do. So part of this homeowner assistance fund allows for necessary home repairs to keep people safe in addition to paying mortgage. So that could be really helpful for some of our low-income owners that, frankly, have mortgages they haven't paid, plus they have a leaking roof and it's unsafe housing conditions. And that also will be true with the second phase of rental assistance. We can do some repairs to apartments with those funds. So we look forward to working on that. I don't see it for a few more months before we start to engage on that second program, but that will be built into our plan.
Representative Kornheiser.
Thanks. I heard about some of these hiccups from folks in the field and was starting to worry that we wouldn't be able to spend the money and that folks weren't getting the money in their pockets and to landlords, which is what we wanted. Are you saying that those are resolved and the money is sort of flowing at the speed that you expected?
And we're putting out over $1 million a week in rental payments. I think a lot of those early hiccups have been addressed. There's still some issues with people submitting incomplete applications that don't have documentation, but there's over 40 Vermont organizations, over 400 Vermont staff trained to help people with applications, have someone call in and help them fill it online. So there's a lot of people working on this in addition to the call center and the national vendor that's helping us. So I think every day the process is getting better and more people are qualifying.
And are you seeing geographic?
Absolutely. Yep. Every county in the state has had assistance and households receiving successful applications and funding.
Thanks.
Any additional questions for our guests? Not seeing any. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Commissioner. And Ms. Collins and our other colleagues here, thanks for joining us. As I said a couple minutes ago, let's move the next agenda item down. Actually, let's do the grants first. So we had been queried as to 2 grant applications, and I had suggested that since we were meeting, that we ought to do this in person rather than what happens sometimes when there's a timing that we do it via email. So we've received, I believe, information on both of these. The first is a request from the Defender General's office for 8 limited service positions in response to the pandemic. And as I said, we've received information. They're available to testify, but if there aren't any questions, we could just approve those or not. If anybody. So are there any questions on the first grant request, in which case we will find the defender? Oh, Laura's here. Ms. Evans is here.
Yeah.
Hello. Hi.
This is,
it's pretty pro forma.
I would agree. This was part of the overall package of assistance to get the courts restarted. And this is just like the courts, we had to deal with their limited service. This is, to me, the same for the Office of Defender General. And so I would move approval of this grant and of the limited service positions because the money's already appropriated.
Terrific. Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Great. Thank you. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you for joining us, Ms. Evans.
Thank you.
I thought you were retiring.
I was going to say.
I am today. Today is my last day.
Well,
congratulations.
Best wishes.
I hope Matt isn't crying too much that you're leaving, but have fun, enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Bye.
Bye.
And then the next grant request is for a limited service position with the military department, their communications. And again, it is to support work that it is for a limited service position for a grant, previously approved grant. Would someone care to make a recommendation with regard to this?
I'll make the motion to approve grant 3058, the 1 limited service position.
Is there a second? All of those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Okay, so going back up to the recommendations of the subcommittee on the fiscal officer transition, we've labeled this as a possible executive session item because we will be talking about a personnel action. But let me remind you what we agreed to do at our last meeting and bring you forward to where we are today. So at our last meeting, we sadly recognized the fact that Mr. Klein gets to retire sometime and that we needed to fill his position, and we set up a process for doing that. We agreed that 5 of us would be would help move that process forward, and that group, Senators Cumming, Kitchell, Representative Fagan, and Ansel, and myself were the interviewing team. But what we also did was have a good conversation with all of the staff at the Joint Fiscal Office. We really wanted to understand their view of this position that will need to be filled, and how we could best find a candidate to do that work, and wanting to support what the really extraordinary work of the Joint Fiscal Office. One of the things that the 5 of us in our conversations have said repeatedly is how remarkable of an organization we have the pleasure of working with, that it is a very high functioning organization, thanks in large part to the leadership of Mr. Klein, but thanks to the work of all of the members of the Joint Fiscal Office, and that it is clearly very much a team environment of one that works extraordinarily well under difficult conditions in a very collaborative way, and that we should, our effort should be to continue to support something very good that is happening there. And we had a conversation about should we just hire internally? Should we just look at ourselves, or should we do a national search to fill this position? And again, coming back to how well organized and what a high functioning organization it is, and good thought given to succession planning, felt that it was appropriate to limit our recruitment to an internal recruitment process. I work closely with the Director of Human Resources in trying to make good decisions, but then also in facilitating that process. We had an excellent candidate whom we've interviewed, and we're ready to make a recommendation to the committee, to the Joint Fiscal Committee, which is responsible for filling this position. That is one of our job duties. And so we are prepared to tell you what our recommendation is. And this is a kind of an awkward point because we like to do things publicly, but we also, I recognize that the committee may want to ask some questions that may involve personnel related issues that may not be as appropriate for public discussion. And so my question to the committee is, would you like to continue this discussion publicly, or would you like to enter into an executive session to have the conversation about what our recommendation is? So the answer would be either to move to go into an executive session or not.
Personally, I'd like to hear more about the deliberation that you went through. And if that requires going into an executive session, then I would recommend we do that.
Okay. I think that's probably a wise, again, we try to be as open and transparent as possible, but I think we should also.
With all this technology, should we just see if that other room is vacant?
Yeah, why don't we walk away?
I still have.
Oh, you
go
have to
offline
go
anyways,
offline.
So it's
Oh,
fine.
you do?
I mean,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
it's your call. So I just, somebody.
So
make a
there is a
motion.
motion to enter into executive session. Is there a second?